This is a classic problem. You get a room full of language teachers, linguists together, and they're all busy talking. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Kerry Mullen. I'm convener of languages here at RMIT. I'd like to welcome you all. I have been asked to tell you that there can be no eating in here, so I don't know. I'm just passing on instructions. So, but there will be eating afterwards, and so please do stay on afterwards for that. Before I explain the format and context for this seminar and introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which we conduct the business of RMIT. I recognise their elders past and present. As well as losing their land when Europeans came to Australia, Indigenous peoples lost their languages. And this is a point I would like to dwell on momentarily, given the topic of this seminar. Many of you will know this already, but according to the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages, VACL, website, prior to colonisation, there were approximately 250 Indigenous languages spoken in Australia, approximately 38 of which were in Victoria. Some of these had several varieties, and altogether there were about 500 language varieties used across Australia. Before settlement, Indigenous individuals spoke 5 or more languages fluently and could identify the region people came from by the way they spoke. Many Australian Indigenous languages have declined to a critical state. More than 3/4 of the original languages have been lost, and many of the remaining ones are threatened. However, Indigenous communities throughout Victoria, supported by VACL, are reviving their languages through language camps, workshops, school programs and educational material for children, music and dictionaries. While VACL was referring specifically to Indigenous languages with the following statements, they're true of all languages. Language is a part of culture, and knowledge about culture is a means of empowering people. Language contributes to the well-being of communities, strengthens ties between elders and young people, and improves education in general for people of all ages. This seminar is the first in a series of workshops exploring multilingualism, organised by the Language, Culture and International Education Research Group. This group is part of the Social and Global Studies Centre at RMIT, and we're very grateful to them for their support in hosting and organising this event. In particular, the director of the centre, Renata, and the leader of our research group, my colleague, Jing Chi. Changes to our teaching brought about by COVID, as well as the current restructuring of all our degrees at RMIT, have led us to question what multilingualism looks like at RMIT and what it might look like in the future, especially given the focus on preparing our graduates to be global citizens who can communicate and collaborate with people from diverse backgrounds and who are committed to diversity, inclusion, and respect for globally inclusive perspectives. Today's seminar is intended to open up the conversation and share some ideas. So before I get to introduce our speaker, and I promise I will get there soon, the format of today's seminar will be a presentation from John, followed by a few questions from me before I open up the floor to a general Q&A session. And in a showcase of our existing multilingualism at RMIT, we are recording this seminar. We'll make it available to everyone, and it will magically have subtitles in various languages, which our translating and interpreting students will be working on post-seminar. Let me now introduce Professor John Hatchek. John is President of the Languages and Cultures Network for Australian Universities, LCIE now, as well as Professor of Italian Studies and Director of the Research Unit for Multilingualism and Cross-Cultural Communication, known as RUMAC, at the University of Melbourne. He is also Vice President of the Slovenian Australian Academic Association. He studied at Oxford, Melbourne, Padua and Florence universities and has received numerous awards, fellowships, prizes and research grants. He has a broad range of research interests as well as many years' experience of language teaching and promoting the importance of multilingualism and language education in Australia in various forums. Now, you don't know this, John, but I foolishly asked one of our colleagues for a recent version of your CV to help me write this introduction. 63 pages long. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about our speaker. Firstly, there are very few people more qualified to speak to us about how we might imagine a multilingual university. And secondly, that John is an incredibly busy colleague, proved by the fact that several of his colleagues from Melbourne Uni are here because they never get to see him up the road. And so we're especially grateful that you accepted our invitation to share your expertise with us today. The floor is finally yours, John.
Thank you. Yep, we're able to go onto the floor. Fantastic. Brilliant, thank you. So I just use that mouse? Yeah, fantastic, thank you. Thank you. Oh, now. Oh, sorry. I'd like also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and acknowledge also the elders past, present and future. I'd also like to thank very much the organisers, Kerry and Jing. It's a great pleasure to accept their invitation, as well as the Language, Culture and International Education Research Group at the RMIT Social and Global Studies Centre. And I'd like to make humble apologies in advance. This is a somewhat random collection of thoughts, but I hope there's something in there for everybody. So thank you very much. So Australia is definitely changing. We have to acknowledge that. The latest census figures show that the proportion of the Australians residents of Australia who speak a language other than English continues to climb, and it will continue to climb for decades more. And our universities are also changing as a reflection of that changing linguistic and demographic profile. So our universities, like Australia, are more multilingual, more multicultural, and more diverse than ever. Universities are also charged, or should be charged if they're not doing it already, and that's an interesting question, should be fostering the multilingual and multicultural skill set of their students as they prepare them for future careers and global citizenship. And just like the society in which we live, multilingualism on campus should be a feature of daily life, whether it's learning, teaching, researching, while picking daisies in the meadows. So I couldn't resist adding that because it's a somewhat whimsical thought. The question is this really the case? Well, I found some very interesting data. There's just to confirm that the multilingual university really is here. Yes, really. Marriott published in 2013, reports on a very large language survey conducted at Monash University. I'm just reporting some of the data here specifically to staff. There were 979 staff respondents, so that's a very, very big sample. I'm actually amazed they got so many people to complete it. And what was surprising about it was that 77% of the respondents said they had at least one language in addition to English. I use the term LOTE here because that's what Marriott uses. I apologise, some people don't like that term. What was even more remarkable was the linguistic diversity amongst those respondents. There were 110 languages identified. Even more surprising to me, perhaps, was that the language most frequently reported was actually French. So Diane and Kerry, you know, it's a nice fact for those in French, but also actually German, Italian and Spanish were very common. Amongst Asian languages, Chinese languages, that's the term Marriott uses, was reported by 11.3%, and Japanese and Indonesian were actually quite common. Now, while it's clear that many of the people answering the survey reported on their mother tongue or other languages that they knew as mother tongues, it's very clear from the results that many of the people reporting on their language capacity were reporting on languages they had acquired through education. not through growing up with the language at home, but acquiring the language at school or at university. So clearly education was a major force in developing the multilingualism that was reported in this particular study. Even more remarkable is that of the respondents, 28% reported using a language other than English at work. I find that quite an extraordinary, very, very pleasing statistic. I just had an example here, a somewhat surprising example. And actually it was the result of this study, going over the study, that gave me the courage to put language in practice. And since I read the article, I've been doing it more courageously outside of normal contexts. Surprisingly, it was used in informal conversation with colleagues, 24% reported that. Reading articles and papers, over 20%. Sending and receiving emails, which I thought was incredible, 21%. Overseas work visits, almost 19%. A remarkable 17.4% talking to students. It's clear that the number of language academics is relatively small, so it can't be due to us talking to our students. Overseas research, collaboration, and even in teaching, quite surprisingly, 8.4% people reported using a language other than English. Of course, these are, this is not like, do I use this every day or whatever? It's some use, and it's really, this is self-reporting, obviously. But what's pleasing about it is how willing people were to report the use of language other than English. And in fact, when they were asked about what they thought about this multilingualism, here are some comments. At an international university, I think most staff should be encouraged to learn another language. And that's pleasing. It's not just about using the language knowledge that they already have, but actually learning another language. I believe it's extremely important that Monash supports its academics to continue. So they're asking the university to do something about this, to study at least one LOTE, to live up to our promise of embracing the world. So that's, that is other internationalization, globalization. And this quote I couldn't resist because I think it really sums it all up. Is there are so many benefits to be gained both professionally and personally, and for the growth, prosperity and cohesiveness of Australia as a nation. I think that's an absolutely fantastic quote that brings together both the personal and the national together, and understanding fully the benefits of multilingualism for both of those contexts. However, this multilingual reality clashes or coexists with a entirely different, what I call monolingual reality. And the truth is that in general, Australian universities prefer not to engage with multilingualism, although to be fair, some may engage a little bit better than others. And as proof of this, I looked at every single university's website, and I could not find one language policy document, other than a couple of instances of English language policy that was specifically about entrance requirements for international students. Other than that, they may exist, and I'm hopeful that a couple of universities actually do have an explicit language policy, multilingual language policy, but I wasn't able to track one down. And in fact, rather than facilitating or fostering multilingualism, what they tend to do is actually have the opposite effect. They tend to make multilingualism harder rather than easier to do. And the question becomes, given the social reality that we live in and the changing nature of universities, why is this so? And ironically, again, it's actually a reflection of the wider world that we live in, and I'll explain shortly. So, oops, sorry, I'm getting in the wrong direction. I'm not used to this. All right, so let's just take a step back. And in 2022, 5 very important academies, such as the Australian Academy of Humanities, in 4 Anglophone countries were so worried about the shrinking language capacity, about the threat to language education and to multilingualism in the respective English-speaking countries, and the need to nurture these things for everybody's benefit, that they released a call for action. And there it is, there's an image there, the importance of languages in global context, an international call for action. And basically what we have is we have a problem because of a convergence of two interlinked phenomena. And I've got a note there to Bostock 1973. This is an Australian paper, I think, from the University of Tasmania, that's been completely forgotten. But if you look at it, it's incredibly prescient. He has his finger on the pulse almost 50 years ago about the problems that we face living in an English-speaking country. Oops, sorry, I can't work out. All right, so one of the biggest problems we have is that, particularly in English-speaking countries, we have a monolingual mindset. And here's a quote from Michael Klein that many of you will have known. The greatest impediment to recognising, valuing and utilising our language potential is a persistent monolingual mindset. Such a mindset sees everything in terms of monolingualism being the norm, even though there are more bi and multilinguals in the world than monolinguals. And on top of that, something that I refer to, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I have a wry sense of humour, is what I call the Anglo bubble, because it is a bubble. And this is the part of the world with a concentration of monolingual English speakers that operates in English, thinks it's only natural that everything should happen in English and should logically be experienced and understood in English. And what I do is, at this point, I often provide some media reports and quotes from people, well-known people, people who are very well known to us, media commentators, etc., who make precisely the point is, why should we be wasting time with anything other than English? English is all you know. And the point is that while English is often said to open up the world for you, I can easily make the point with lots of examples, but I won't give them today, that actually for these first language English speakers, or actually for anybody who speaks English really, it's very easy for English to hide the world from us. And that's a risk that we have to live with. So going back to that document, I just want to highlight some of the text. As global businesses, diplomatic corps and other leaders have repeatedly stated, language education, which I have underscored, and the accompanying linguistic and intercultural competencies are a necessity for social, political and economic development and for effective collaboration. And the Americans repeat this as well. This is from America's Languages, Investing in Language Education for the 21st Century. The ability to understand, speak, read and write in world languages, in addition to English, is critical to success in business, research and international relations in the 21st century. So obviously you would have thought that for international relations in particular, language knowledge would be an asset. So how ready are we for these things? And what are Australian universities preparing us for? So this is the results. I'm presenting you with some results from a big international survey of academics working in international relations. And the question is, on the left, you can see there, other than your native language, how many foreign languages do you understand well enough to conduct scholarly research? So this is from the Global Survey of International Relations Academics. And I've organised the table for you, and I have colour-coded English-speaking countries. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the English-speaking countries are down the bottom of the table. And so the higher up you are in the table, the more multilingual you are in practice. So for instance, Brazil at the top, 50% of the Brazilian respondents use 3 or more languages in addition to their native language to conduct research in international relations. If we go down to the bottom, you may or may not be surprised to see that Australia is right at the bottom. And in fact, if you look at the none column, 49% of Australian respondents did not use a language other than English for their research on international relations. I think that's both telling and also extremely worrying, because what happens is people are talking to themselves in English, doing everything in English, possibly in translation, not necessarily very good, or simply just not accessing alternative viewpoints, alternative information, etc. So we are operating in a bubble. This is the Anglo bubble that I'm talking about. And you can see that if you look across from left to right in Australia, the lowest proportion, only 6% of respondents in Australia reported using 3 languages or more. But what's particularly telling is that all of the English-speaking countries are down the bottom. Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, South Africa, Ireland, Canada, and Singapore, which has joined the English-speaking world. How often do you rely on material not written in your native language to conduct scholarly research? And you can see the Finns up the top there, 100% of the time, regularly rely on material not written in their native language. Okay, we might not be surprised about that. There's not a lot of work done in international relations on a global scale in Finnish. That's not so surprising. Argentina, 100% again. That's perhaps a little bit more surprising. There is a huge Spanish-speaking population in the world. And again, if I draw your attention to where the yellow is, we're down the bottom of the table. And I draw, on this occasion, I have some good news. Australia's not right at the bottom. We have a little bit of competition. So, and in this particular case, New Zealand just pips us. We need to do better, people. Next time we have to be right at the bottom. We can't let New Zealand pip us. But again, it's that same observation. If you look where the yellow is concentrated, they're all English-speaking countries. Clearly, English language universities, English medium universities are not preparing experts in international relations for a broader multilingual world. It's actually quite worrying for me. We're talking to ourselves and talking and listening to ourselves and not listening to other people. So what's wrong with our universities? I don't want to criticize our universities. I love them. I work there, but sometimes, we have to say these things. We have a strongly monolingual English approach. Language is often focused on English remediation. So when they talk about language at university, it's how we can make the English of our students better. Internationalization and globalization. If you look at the strategy documents, they typically make no reference to to language at all. Implicit, if it's not explicit, implicit is that it will all be done in English. Marketing is almost always in English. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen any university marketing in the Australian context that's not in English. There's also a strong bias against other languages in important areas of activity, such as research. It's clear, and it's not just an Australian local phenomenon. This is the way international mechanisms operate as well. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. There's a huge native speaker pool of English speakers. There's an additional huge pool of people who have English as L2 or L3. So you have automatically, in terms of research weight and pull, you're obviously going to do much better in English language pool than you might, for instance, in Italian or Greek or Finnish, etc. So there's, these are self-perpetuating mechanisms, and certainly those things that monitor and assess research tend to favour English language very strongly. And there are often actually restrictions placed explicitly on other languages. So at my own institution, for a while there were no restrictions on what language your PhD could be in. Not that people very often wrote their PhD in a language other than English, but if you're in a language department such as my own, it's entirely plausible, reasonable for a PhD candidate to want to write their PhD in French, Italian or Spanish, and that wasn't considered to be an issue. We now have a regulation that was introduced a few years ago that says I have to ask for special permission for that student to do so. And not only do I have to ask for special permission, actually they often say no. So, which I find even more peculiar and bizarre. But, and I don't actually understand what the logic of the restriction is, nor why it was brought in. There was no evidence of any risk to the reputation of the university, nor of any huge preparation of PhDs in languages other than English. And what you get instead is where there is reference to other languages, often it's referred to as a kind of a fun add-on, or if more seriously as a specialization. And with regard to this fun add-on, a few years ago, my own university prepared a new draft strategy, for the university, and it literally said in this draft, oh, and while you're at university, you can also do a language or theatre as after hours activities. there was a huge ruckus as a result. I think they were quite surprised that anyone would have thought that that was a problem. They had to delete that, but at no point since then has there been any reference to language proficiency, multilingualism, etc. in our strategic documents. So if that's the case, oops, is the multilingual university in crisis? Well, a lot of people think so. Certainly the academies do. But I don't want to present an entirely gloomy picture, but I would like to ask the question, how true is this with respect to language provision? And my argument is that we probably need a more nuanced understanding about language provision at university, but I'll get to that later. However, the initial evidence is not very good. And the evidence from overseas is that in recent years in the United Kingdom, there's been a 34% reduction in the number of modern language programs in British universities. It's actually gained speed since Brexit. There's both been a significant drop in enrolments, but there's also been a significant cut to language programs. In the USA, it's quite interesting. Between 2009 and 2012, there was only a net loss of one foreign language program. However, since 2013, in that 4-year period, there was a net loss of 651 language programs. That's quite an extraordinary shift and quite worrying. Even in Scandinavia, which we know is epicenter of multilingualism, most Scandinavians have 2, 3, or if not 4 languages. Even there, weirdly enough, they are closing language programs, because people are so focused on English that there's been a big decline in interest in French, German, Spanish, etc. And weirdly enough, in some of those countries, they've been closing English departments because there's been a drop-off in interest in English departments, because students don't need them anymore because they're so proficient in English in primary school and secondary school, they don't need to learn English at university. It's quite extraordinary. And this is the impact of English, and it's happening around us, and we don't necessarily understand what's going on. So what about Australia? Well, in 2007, the G08 universities released a document called Languages in Crisis, a rescue plan for Australia. So it's certainly, when you get this kind of rhetoric, it certainly feels like there's a crisis. But where does this feeling come from? And I would argue that partly it's got to do with the way language education is reported in the press. Oops, sorry, I'm going to get this right up. I keep pressing the wheel in the wrong direction. So why is press coverage so important? I've done a number of studies with a colleague of mine, Shannon Mason, and we make the case that media coverage both reflects and influences public perceptions. Public perceptions influence and are influenced by policy decisions. Policy decisions influence and are influenced by media coverage. So what we see in the press is liable to tell us something about what's happening. Oops, sorry, I've got to do it this way. All right, so in the time frame that we looked at from 2007 and 2016, these are all the references to language programs at university. And you can see there's not a lot. And by 2015, 2016, in this huge corpus of Australian media reporting, we only had one reference to university language teaching education in the whole country, in the corpus. In 2012, we had 15, which is quite extraordinary, but that's got to do with the release of the federal government's Asian Century document, which then very quickly disappeared and hasn't been heard of since. We also looked at the tone to see whether it was positive or negative, and you can see that about half of it was quite negative in the red, 27 of these reports. About 15 were positive in the green, 13 were neutral, and in 2 cases, not applicable. And just to give you an idea, only 8 headlines refer explicitly to the university sector, and the ones that are in red are negative. just to make it easier for you. So you can see that out of 8 headlines referring to languages at university, 5 of them are in some way have a negative tone. So it's definitely not a positive image that is being spread through the media, and definitely not a positive image that's coming through from policy, etc. So 32 articles discuss specific languages or language groups. However, they were almost entirely concentrated on Indonesian, and we'll come back to that in a second, as well as Asian languages. And if you have a look, there's no reference to any European language in all of this time. And Indonesian, Korean, Hindi, and Mandarin were 4 of the 5 priority languages noted in the Asian Century document. So then some questions and thoughts, but how true really is this sense of crisis across the sector? Is it imagined or real? Now, Brown and Caruso in a recent paper, 2020, have had it's quite an interesting paper. I don't agree with some of it, but they say, you know, we shouldn't be so anxious about languages education in our universities. This talk of crisis, there isn't such a crisis at all. And another interesting study by John West Suby from 2020, which it takes a much longer historical frame, he talks about what he calls the waxing and waning of languages in our universities. And I think that may possibly be a better metaphor. It certainly makes us feel more comfortable. It avoids that language of crisis. So, but sometimes crisis has a real basis, and Indonesian is a clear example. So you saw that in that word cloud that Indonesian was very prominent, and that's because that is a result of a report that was published by a colleague from Western Australia talking about the precarious state of Indonesian language education in schools, but in particular at our universities, and trying to garner public and government support, official support, to protect Indonesian programs. However, an additional simple example points to the indirect and direct consequence of conscious acts. And I just want to show you this extraordinary quote. So this is entirely foreseen. So this is this is a direct quote taken out of the Adelaide Review, 6 months before this person took up a role as VC. And so they made it very clear what they were going to do. One of the things we will do in relation to COVID-19, I'm going to pare down everything that doesn't speak to technology or science. Because do we need to be the 10th university that teaches Chinese or Italian? No. We are the Swinburne University of Technology. We're going to be working with industry and students on creating the technology of the future. Clearly, implicitly, a monolingual future. So you can imagine the impact this had on our colleagues at Swinburne, because this was quite well known to them 6 months before the arrival of the VC. This is public information, so I'm just relating it to you. Perhaps more extraordinarily about this is the person in question is a highly successful bilingual for whom English is their second language. That's probably the thing that that strikes me the most. Okay, so if we are in crisis, who can help us? Can governments help us? Actually, as a result of Swinburne University, as a result of an erroneous document that was sent, they had to redo a document, and which gave them the opportunity to change the wording of a clause. And that clause has now been instituted in all documents. So all universities have a funding agreement with the federal government. They must abide by it. And what they've now done is actually notionally at least strengthened requirements around closures. So universities are supposed to consult the Commonwealth government with respect to the closure of particular courses. And interestingly enough, if you see that second point, one of those areas of priority, for example, in science, engineering, computing, allied health, education, and languages. So that's meant to be a positive signal to the university sector that languages are important and should be protected. In practice, when the federal government is asked about program closures, they normally always say yes. It's just a no. It's, you know, it's more theoretical than real, but hypothetically, it could work in our favour. We also currently have now, at the moment, this is under revision because we have a new government. We have the previous government funded a big project called the National Languages Plan and Strategy that's being developed by the Australian Federation of Modern Teaching Language Associations. That's been worked on over the last 18 months, and we're going to have an update at the LCIE colloquium in November. So that's some kind of positive thing. But also the Jobs Ready Graduates policy, in which there's a very clear price signal to universities. And this is really important. It's not just to students, it's a price signal to universities that languages are desirable and universities should link them to improved employability. Now, what do I mean by that? What they've done is they have very clearly the current funding model very clearly differentiates languages from other areas of humanities and social sciences. And what they've done is they've dramatically reduced the cost of language courses to university students. So it's now about, it's way cheaper than any other course. So I think it's about $500 a language course as opposed to $3,500 for humanities and social sciences. But at the same time, they've also increased the amount of direct funding to universities so that the total contribution, student and universities, is significantly higher than the contribution that they get for humanities and social sciences, for whether from the student or the government. And this quote comes from the National Plan and Strategy. It's about seeing, being and doing. So just in terms of getting our graduates ready for the future, these dot points on these are not all of them, but I've taken a selection. Those dot points on the left are, please ignore the yellow highlight for a moment. These are based on a study done for the Institute for the Future, for the University of Phoenix in United States, looking at what future employees coming out of our universities, what skills they will need to have. Sense-making, social intelligence, novel and adaptive thinking, cross-cultural competency, transdisciplinarity, cognitive load management, virtual collaboration. And I've highlighted the ones that I think are most obviously related to graduates in languages or graduates who have multilingual skills. So you can see that universities should be preparing, around the world, should be preparing our students with providing them with multilingual capacity and skills, because they are in turn getting them ready for the future economy. There's also, in terms of understanding the world, we can think of this as the kind of industrial international relations if we want. And I want to give you this example. I don't know if anyone knows, put your hand up if you are aware of this reference. Has anyone seen this image in any way? Yep, well, okay, that's interesting. This was huge, absolutely huge last year. This is a still taken out of a music clip for a song called Fragile. And the singer, the female on the left, is actually from Melbourne originally, and the guy on the right is a Malaysian Chinese rapper. And I don't know if you notice some of the images there. You can see there's a lot of pink. You can see panda bears, etc., etc., etc. This caused huge ruckus in the Chinese-speaking world. And within a matter of weeks, that singer, I can't remember her name, actually both of them, had been eliminated from social media in China. Why would that be the case? She was actually quite well known until the release of this song. She was quite well known in China, had quite a big profile. She's actually based in, she's Taiwanese, I think, not sure she was born here, but lived here for many years and has gone back to Taiwan. She was simply removed very quickly. Why would that be the case? Well, it's hard for us to understand. You need to have the skill set to understand what's going on. And in fact, one of the best explanation in English of what exactly is going on in that song and in that clip, because both the song, you need to know both of them, is done by this fellow here. His name is Stuart. I think his surname is Roy. He's actually a graduate of Griffith University. I think he's fantastic. He's definitely multilingual. He's learnt Chinese and Japanese and Malaysian, etc. And he's prepared a couple of video clips in which he has in very close detail explained exactly what's going on. And I recommend you have a look at those clips. It's fascinating. And in fact, he's even corrected himself because people have given him feedback. What's even more interesting is the feedback he's got from Chinese speakers saying, I can't believe you've decoded this. I can't believe what you know. This is extraordinary. So to get that kind of feedback loop from the Chinese speaking community is quite remarkable. I'd strongly recommend you have a look at the clip because it's from the first second, the political message all the way through is incredibly clear. But for us, watching this video and listening to this song, we just think, God, this is some really sickly sweet song with some really sickly sweet video. This will appeal to 12-year-olds or whatever, but in fact, this is very, very cleverly constructed. Okay, so if there's crisis, let's have a look at languages provision. It took me ages to do this, but some interesting results here. I had a look to see over a 10-year frame, the idea, one of the languages in crisis issue was that there had been a significant decline in language offerings, etc. And what I did was actually have a little bit of a look and did a big count. It was a lot of work. Yellow if there's a decline, green if there's an increase, blue if there's no change, and orange if there's a complete loss. And you can see that there is a marginal drop in some languages, but not really of a huge concern. If you had a look at the programs that were closed over those 10 years, they weren't very strong programs to start with. There's specific reasons, etc. So it's okay. And interestingly enough, some languages like French and Spanish actually increased in terms of the number of programs that were available. More surprising, these are we can call them global languages, but more surprising perhaps is, oops, hold on, not working. Oh, hold on, let me see. Is actually, I was quite shocked by this. Ancient Greek and Latin seem to be very fashionable at the moment. So there's been a massive expansion in programs. There's obviously been a return to classics around the world. Korean, not surprisingly. Oh, actually, ancient Greek, Latin, and ancient Hebrew. It's quite remarkable, the expansion. But actually, Korean, not surprisingly, there's a lot of interest amongst young people in Korean, and they're fascinated by it. So these moderately taught languages have actually done surprisingly well. More disturbing, however, and there's hardly any change. Actually, there's an increase in the number of languages offered from 45 to 46. 12 languages are offered by more universities, 11 by fewer universities, 23 by the same number of universities. 22 languages are no longer offered. But when you look at those languages that are no longer offered, they're always exceptionally marginal. A course in Welsh, 1 semester of Welsh at a university, 1 semester of Lao at a university, etc. They were never, significant endeavours. What's more disturbing, however, I think this is something we really have to think about, is language as a privilege. And what I did was I then looked at the universities according to the type of grouping that they found themselves in, and there's a real standout. So you can see group of 8 universities. They're offering an average of 7 languages each. ATN universities, RMIT is part of that network. There's been a slight drop. It's not bad, 4.2, but significantly different from GO8. Innovative research universities, 3.3, and the regional universities basically are barely present. And in fact, it's getting worse in regional Australia. You have very limited access to language education if you're not in a large urban centre. So this, I think, is probably something that we need to reflect on. Some universities are better at facilitating multilingualism than others. So we do have to be careful. It's easy to generalise, but there are many institution-specific processes and effects as well. What we do need is much greater visibility. We need normalisation of language education and multilingualism. But the biggest issue we have for our students is access. This is really the biggest issue. And it's actually been a long-standing issue in the Australian university sector. University of Adelaide has been offering modern languages since 1882, but only to science students. You had to wait as an art student, which I find amazing. You couldn't do a language as an art student until 1887. In 1964, I just love this statistic, almost 30% of art students were taking language study. That is a remarkable statistic. Nowhere near that proportion of art students are taking languages today. But what I like is the fact is that 139 people were doing a language in some other faculty. I mean, that just shows you what barriers there are to language study. And this is really the big problem. Students don't enrol if they can't enrol. You know, we've taken steps to improve access, such as the Diploma of Languages, the Bachelor of Languages, etc., opening up of degree structures across the university. And, you know, it works on the principle, I don't know, this is the famous quote from the movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. And it is absolutely the case. If you provide students with the structures, they will take up the opportunities. So these are data from the University of Western Australia. They adopted a similar structure that Melbourne University adopted, in which all students in all degrees, at least hypothetically, had access to subjects outside of their home degree. We call it breadth or broadening in Western Australia. And this was one of the huge benefits of it was there was a huge increase in the number of students taking languages. So literally, one of the big challenges is students want to do languages, they just can't. And this is a constant refrain with our own students at my own institution. We have the breadth system, but amazingly, students often tell us, I can't continue, I have no space in my degree. I don't quite know how that's possible because it's supposed to be possible, but actually when you start investigating, there are blockers put in their way to stop them from doing so. All right, so can a multilingual university become a real reality? Well, certainly I think we need to work together to improve access. There definitely has to be more active and lots of positive messaging about multilingualism on campus in broader society. Universities need to plan for languages openly and fully integrate multilingualism in their plans and structures. It's clear that top-down support is essential. We do need language policies, documents for universities. And to give you an idea of what is possible, this is a university in Lithuania. It's a little paper, but quite interesting. They've developed a language policy document that takes places a very active emphasis on both choice and access to languages. And I just want to show you what happens. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. In 2004, they had 14 languages on offer, of which, and 21% of undergraduate students were doing language study. By 2011, extraordinarily, they were offering 26 languages and 68% of all of their students were doing languages. So I think that's something that we can aspire to. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I can do this from here. I'm just looking at the time. So instead of my questions first, I think I'll throw it open and I will come in with my questions while you're thinking about them. But I will just stop sharing the screen just for a second.
Sure, I'll go. So, John, that was fantastic. Thank you. It was really interesting. Wondering about about students who are already bilingual or multilingual, right? And the extent to which we engage their language skills in our teaching. And it seems to me we don't. We teach exclusively in English, assuming that all our graduates are going to be working in English, even if they're international students who are going to be going home. And I'm just wondering if you've come across any examples of teaching students how to use their language skills in their professional practice. So whether it's nurses being able to use their language to work with clients in hospitals or whatever from their background, or design students being able to work in multilingually, or accounting students and so on. But it seems to me that huge opportunity there, and that international students and local students alike would benefit a lot from that kind of education, in addition to the type you're talking about, which is sort of acquisition of foreign languages. But it seems to me there's a lot of potential for both of those things. Just wondering the difference.
Sorry, you've got to be working at an institution that allows for that kind of thing. Allows you to attach something to, dual sector universities that are a better place to allow that for that kind of thing. I do know, actually, that's sorry. A colleague of mine who was working at University of South Australia, she was trying very hard to get nursing students to do Italian, partly to address the need of the ageing Italian population in South Australia, the language skills. And I remember she found it very hard to get space. The nursing faculty, obviously, it's got its own priorities, not enough space in the degree. She found it very challenging to get, the logic that she was putting forward to be accepted as something that was essential to a nursing degree.
John, thank you very much for the input. I just want to, you raised the whole issue of doing PhDs in languages other than English. And I want to say, my corporate memory of RMIT and its feeder institutions goes back to 1979. But we did have the scope to offer PhDs in languages other than English. And I think we still do, but I'm not sure about that. It came up in the early 90s when we were negotiating with RMIT about languages and so on. And Phillip Institute of Technology, remembering that the International Language Studies cluster here now, the higher ed bit comes from Phillip Institute and the TAFE bit comes from the old RMIT before the amalgamation. And we had, there was only one case that I recall where a student did his PhD in Greek, and it was allowed. And when that came up at the amalgamation, these negotiations, it was allowed, but I never saw it in writing. So the guy who did his PhD in Greek language was a guy called Panos Baltagis. I'm not sure what he did it on. I can't remember now. I probably read the abstract, but it did happen. There is a precedence in RMIT for that. Secondly, I'm interested in your concept of world languages, because I think that's a very important issue. And I'll use the example of Italian. I spent 4 years studying in Italy at the end of the 60s, and almost no Italian spoke English. Yet when you go there now, the majority do, certainly the younger ones. And a few months ago, there was consternation in the Vatican when a well-known American cardinal said that the Vatican should use English, not Italian, as the lingua franca for the church. So that's, that's an interesting, is Italian an international language? And lastly, I had an Asian organization that has 22 member nations. And pre-COVID, when we sat around the table, I was the only native English speaker. Everyone else spoke English except for the Chinese, who still today use an interpreter for the online meetings, as we had one last week actually. So the concept of world languages and which ones, and I mean, normally they're distinguished from national languages and so on. So I'm interested in your response.
I mean, I don't actually use the term world languages very often. The thing about the use of English, I'm more than happy for people to use English, but for me, the issue is that there should be some reciprocation, is that English speakers should make the effort to learn other languages, and actually not only make the effort, but it should be a natural part of who they are, much like it is for Swedes. So one of our former PhD students, Lee Oakes, I don't know if you knew Lee, he did a PhD, quite interesting, looking at Swedes and French, about language and identity there. And actually for the French, obviously you have to speak French, and that's the only language in terms of language identity. But for the Swedes, weirdly enough, to be considered a true Swede, you have to speak Swedish and English. And that was actually what young Swedish people said. Well, if you want to be a Swede, actually English is just as important as being Swedish. Now, we should be, you know, for us, it should be the English plus one or two or whatever. I mean, it's just about that ability to do what others are doing. If they're willing to take on a second language, we should also be willing and have the means and resources to do so. I hope that sort of kind of responds to your comments.
One last point. You raised the issue of the funding of languages in the agreements and the formula between the universities and the Commonwealth. I think that's always been there, that languages were funded at a higher rate than the normal social science or humanities course. I'm interested if you know to what extent it's gone up and down.
Well, that's what's happened, is that they've dramatically reduced the cost to students, and in order to, they were always funded at a higher level, but to maintain that higher level, they've increased the government subsidy while the student cost has dropped dramatically. That's really the difference. It doesn't change the differentiation, it just changes who's paying for it. So the government is putting in a lot more funding.
Okay.
Two hands up, up at one first.
Well, universities can use the funding to run their own programs. There's no restrictions on how many hours, etc. It's just in terms of number of courses a student is enrolled in. That's the only input that the government has.
I find that learning Chinese instead to learn Chinese which is university Indonesian and Chinese together. Things like that, Chinese speaking, but I found that instruments of interest.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues. I mean, that's a local university decision about how many hours of tuition they provide. The relationship between the funding is not necessarily direct. Once money comes to the university, some magic happens somewhere, and we wonder where all that funding goes. So that's just normal part of a university's existence, I'm afraid. And there are very big discrepancies across universities in Australia between the number of, with regard to the number of contact hours for different languages. So there's no consistent number, and there's no requirement from the government in terms of funding about what you're supposed to do. It works on the basis, part of the rationale is that you get extra funding because we know that for improved language acquisition, smaller group teaching is more appropriate. And that's the justification, smaller group teaching. And we often have to use that at our university to say, please don't make our groups too big because actually we're funded for smaller group teaching. So that's across the national sector. You'll often hear people that make that argument.
Wish the PVC hadn't walked out 2 minutes ago at our college. Jean had her hand up and then hers.
So do you think engaging multilingual actually push universities to relevance society?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a reflection of the society that we live in. We need to activate the multilingualism that is around us all the time. You know, as you know, the problem is we have a parallel world of monolingualism and multilingualism, but it's there for us. Certainly, people outside of Australia are taking advantage of multilingualism, often at our expense, because they're learning English and other languages, and we're not able to respond to the same degree. So clearly, absolutely essential for the well-being of this country.
The second question relates to the first question. We need to rethink what actually counts as university business in reimagining a multilingual university, because I think university business should not be restricted to very multilingual, but also of the regulations, a lot of the industry, a lot of shadow work or existing already there that we have not documented.
No, I agree. I mean, language policy, explicit language policy around these kinds of things would address those kinds of things. We just need to get the explicit language policy and get all of those things in.
I'll go to Hariz and I'll make this the last question, and there will be refreshments. I'll sneak Yasho in after Hariz, and then there'll be refreshments afterwards so we can continue the conversation.
John, ja ću malo da se našalim pa ću pričati na hrvatskom, neću prevoditi. Zahvaljujem ti se na ovom izuzetnom predavanju i ovo je prvi put, jedini put da ja pitam pitanje u ovakvom formu na hrvatskom jeziku, iako je engleski moj predzadnji jezik koji sam učio, tako malo je ovako da se našalim, a jeste prilika da upitam pitanje. So guys, just John is multilingual, this is multilingual university, so you need to adjust. But the actual comment more than a question is really how our language skills attract our students. So I guess most of us would have that experience where, especially at graduate level, PhD students approach us because of our language skills. And even though it's not marketed, it's not recognized, it's not added, and I know that in many actually other professions, people who speak more than one language, they get additional allowance, they get, it's recognized somehow formally. And at university, this is at least not recognized as an advantage, even though it does work as an advantage, kao što smo sada vidjeli dok ja pitam tebe ovo pitanje koje jedino ti, Renata, razumijete, je li tako? Ali odgovori na hrvatskom nešto.
A couple of things I have to respond. So after I read Marriott, I thought, if all of these people are doing all of these things, I'm going to start doing this as well. So today I wrote an email to teach a European Studies course. I wrote the email in English, and then I wrote a line. Actually, I wrote it in Croatian, and I wondered whether anyone would notice. And I turned up to class today, and I was very excited. And I said, "Did anyone notice anything different about the email?" I go, "No." So that didn't work. But but it clearly. I know I put it in the bottom, and it was actually very relevant to the topic we were talking about today, because it was devoted to the lecture was on the former Yugoslavia. So I have to thank Marriott for giving me the courage to do so. It's actually, and also just as a personal note, it's very. This just gives you an indication of what the space of the university is like. It's very odd for me to speak Croatian in a university setting. It's completely out of the context I would normally.
As I said, it's very good. The first time in my life,
yeah.
I asked a question.
Yeah. So thank you. I was thinking, my temperature was starting to rise. I think, oh God, I speak fantastic kitchen Croatian, but my high level register is extremely limited. So if it's going to be a technical question, I'm going to be in trouble. No, look, it's funny about our language skills not being recognised. I was reading an article just the other day in Canada where Canadian public servants are paid an extra $800 a year if they're officially bilingual in French and in English. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And then they pointed out that that payment had not been increased since it was instituted in 1974. So you know, there's always a downside to everything. But thank you so much. And that is a classic example of the multilingual university. We just have to adjust to the new reality. Thank you. Yeah, fala tempo.
Okay, well, let me draw that to a close, and please join me again in thanking John. Yasha will keep your question till we go outside. And yes, here's to a multilingual university. It can be done.
Can be done. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.